Do you want the best exercise prescription software available? What if it included shoulder exercises by Joe Gibson? And how about fully customizable text, inbuilt virtual consultation software, and you can send by email or WhatsApp? Just go to rehabmypatient.com/physiomatters now for a 3-month free trial and get all of those things.
Marlize De Vivo, welcome to Chewing It Over. Is exercise dangerous for pregnant women?
Really good question. And the short answer is no. For the majority of women, it is safe to continue being active in their pregnancy. But of course, with most things, there's a caveat. And I guess that's why we're here today, to chat about
Absolutely. So tell folk a little bit about yourself and a little bit about your journey and career so far, because we're going to get stuck into some of the stuff that the questionnaire and other screening work is going to help assist it. But I think that your story really tells a tale itself. So what's your background?
Right. So I relocated to the UK 18 years ago now. And at the time, I was a qualified biokineticist, so a clinical exercise specialist. And I was also pregnant. And I was thrown into the UK healthcare system. And knowing what I had to do and being very active myself, I had all sorts of finger wagging and people pointing at me whilst I was in the gym working out. And I couldn't for the life of me understand why this was happening. And as I started to ask the right questions, I realized that in the UK, there was no guidance for women on being active in their pregnancy. And that really started off my journey. So my daughter, when she turned 6 months, I then started a master's degree, and I sort of pushed for a study involving pregnant women. And I was met with sort of all sorts of restrictions in terms of, no, you cannot do that because we don't have guidelines. Ethical committees will never approve this study. And I was just sort of completely in disbelief around what the state was around supporting women to be active in their pregnancies and indeed also postnatal periods. And from there on, I sort of pushed through. I eventually did a study in football, as you do. But then I moved on and I pursued a PhD and eventually started investigating physical activity behaviors in pregnant women. Because there was no guidance, I was sent sort of down a psychological theory type of route to try and understand the behavior rather than doing any sort of physiological interventions. And then just as my PhD was published in 2017, the UK, for the first time ever, released a set of national physical activity guidelines for pregnant women. And of course, that just opened the door to so much more research. We had an entire workforce to then upskill. And what we also realized is that because more research was happening, that the evidence was not necessarily being communicated in an effective way to the masses and also to healthcare and fitness professionals. So it didn't have the impact that we wanted it to have. And at that point, I met a group of women who sort of agreed with me and shared my passions. And through that, we set up a charity, the Active Pregnancy Foundation. And that's really how where I am now. We are trying to reach the masses with evidence-based information, hoping to change the narrative around active pregnancies.
The Active Pregnancy Foundation was something that partly contributions from you to the original Therapy Live events and really popular sessions that you did and contributed to there made me more and more aware of the work you were doing there. I've found myself using and signposting to your work as much personally as I have professionally. Just the nature of the timing as well, if we think about when that was. And my wife had just had twins, probably even when we'd last spoken. And so the amount of times that then in conversations we're asked that question, partly it might be skewed because we're physios by background, but generally speaking, it's like, is this safe? And the overwhelming sort of instinct, and I understand where it comes from, but it is a massively overwhelming instinct, is just better be safe than sorry, err on the side of caution, use all the various different cautious language to associate, because it's just like, if in doubt, let's not. What are the implications of having a less active or inactive pregnancy that makes you so passionate about the fact that then doing that because you feel it's unsafe clearly motivates you to then try to bang the drum for something different? So can you give us a clue as to what that means?
Yeah, so absolutely. So the evidence now tells us that in actual fact, by not being active in your pregnancy, your children are being born at a health disadvantage. We now know the evidence is that strong, but for the mother herself, there are significant benefits over and above that of just, generally being physically active. So we know, for example, it's associated with a decreased risk of developing preeclampsia, gestational hypertension, excessive weight gain in pregnancy, delivery complications, developing postnatal depression, and indeed also fewer newborn complications. So there's significant benefits that is unique to pregnancy when mothers meet the recommended guidelines for being active in their pregnancy. And I'm going to use this statistics because I love this, because it just makes the case for why we should really be investing in this topic area. So researchers in Canada actually found that depression, preeclampsia, and gestational diabetes are reduced by 40 to 67% without increasing the risk of adverse pregnancy outcomes, including miscarriage, preterm delivery, and having a small or large for gestational age baby. Now, we know in the UK particularly, our health system is under significant strain, and the cost of health services and treating conditions such as gestational diabetes, hypertension, excessive weight gain is also associated with obesity. It's significant. So we should really be seeing physical activity or being more active in pregnancy as that first opportunity for intervention, not just for the health of women, but also for future generations. And in doing so, reducing the economic burden on our health service, but also improving overall quality of life.
Wow, I mean, I wasn't aware of those numbers, and they are bigger than I could have ever imagined, really. And I feel a bit naive for thinking you'd expect it to move the needle, and I've been influenced by some of yours and your colleagues' work, but I didn't realize to that extent. That is a significant public health movement as well. The way that, like you say, would affect healthcare strain is huge. What's the sort of general gist for when people are, say, because it's all well and good as saying when people are pregnant, but what about when there's sort of family planning that's occurring, and then people are thinking, what could I be doing to set the scene on this? Do we have evidence to that effect?
So I'm assuming you are talking specifically around the preconception period, being more active in that period. So we know, well, there's really good research now to say that taking care of a woman and improving her health during the preconception period improves pregnancy outcomes. So it's a really important case. But we also know that being active and having a healthy lifestyle before or whilst trying to conceive improves the chances of conception. So there's also a good case in improving fertility. But from a psychological perspective, we know that women who are active before pregnancy are more likely to be active during pregnancy, and we know that women who are active in pregnancy are then more likely to resume physical activity then again after pregnancy. And I think that is, for us, that is the public health concern is in losing women to this active lifestyle when having children. So having a child and becoming pregnant in itself is an actual fact considered a barrier to an active lifestyle. So we should really be thinking about ways of creating more positive habits in terms of physical activity right through from preconception to pregnancy. And in doing so, we support women to enjoy from active lifestyles throughout their childbearing years, rather than pregnancy being this barrier that stops them from engaging in physical activity altogether.
Now, there may be a risk of me indulging a bit of a myth, but I think one of the big concerns that I know of and have even advised in this direction before is not to radically change your exercise habits to be more volume, more intensity when falling pregnant. And therefore, having a baseline that then is continued or only subtly stepped up means that would make sense. Is that still the sort of sensible guidance?
Absolutely. So in terms of women who are already active, the recommendation is if you are already active and healthy, you can continue being active at whatever intensity you are being active at. So if you are active at a moderate intensity, that's where the bulk of the evidence is based in anyway. We know that it is safe for you to continue for as long as possible, but recognizing that some modification might be required as pregnancy progresses. For women who are significantly exceeding that sort of 150 minutes of moderate intensity physical activity per week, the recommendation is to seek additional advice and support. So, for example, they may need additional checkups or more monitoring in terms of their physical activity levels. But for the most part, you are quite right. If you have that physical activity base, you can continue at that level for as long as possible. Now, for women who aren't necessarily or weren't necessarily active, and they come into pregnancy and they see this as an opportunity to make positive lifestyle changes and they want to be more active, we now know, and it's about busting the myth that you can't start anything new in pregnancy. You absolutely can, but you have to be sensible about how you go about in choosing those activities. So you can gradually build up your physical activity levels, but if you weren't necessarily taking part in a vigorous intensity activity, you shouldn't be doing vigorous intensity activities in your pregnancy. So best to start gradually and build it up over time.
Now, pregnancy is an incredibly sacrificial act in many ways. It's something that, in every way, biopsychosocially, it's something that, and those instincts, I've witnessed firsthand as being incredible. What my wife was willing and continues to be willing to put herself through for her children, but that can sometimes be seen as a direct trade-off almost, that I'm willing to do this but actually what we're describing here is that spending that time for your health is not to the detriment of your child. It's actually going to enhance their health as a continuum of your biology. And I think that's one of the things where it's like, well, if I'm out of breath, then the baby's out of breath. It's like, well, to some extent, if you're challenged, the baby's challenged. But within what we now know of exercise physiology is that at the right dosage, then that is, of course, a good thing for both you and baby. And getting that penny to drop is huge. Now, one of the things that you guys have done is create a lovely tool that then further translates this material. It's all well and good us talking about this as sort of therapists and healthcare professionals, but the new questionnaire that you guys have, well, it's not that new, but a fairly new questionnaire has made it super accessible. Can you tell us a little bit about that and how you see that proliferating?
Yes, of course. So the Get Active questionnaire for pregnancy was originally developed in Canada by the Canadian Society of Exercise Physiology. And they convened in December 2019, and they brought together a group of multidisciplinary professionals, so obstetricians and gynecologists, physiotherapists, exercise physiologists. And they recognized that at the time we were using the PARMED-X. Now, the PARMED-X was a screening tool, a pre-participation screening tool that was based on the concept of women needed medical clearance before they could engage in physical activities. It was a 4-page form, and healthcare professionals actually said that it takes too long to complete in clinical practice, and they didn't really have time to manage all of that. So the Canadian Society of Exercise Physiology brought together this working group, and they said, look, we need a new tool. It needs to be user-friendly. It needs to be, accessible to women. So we're going to empower women so that they can use this themselves. They can self-administer this. Mm-hmm. To be based on the latest evidence in terms of contraindications. So they did that. And in 2021, they released this tool and a companion healthcare professional consultation form in Canada. And in 2022, the Active Pregnancy Foundation and British Association of Sport and Exercise Sciences, or BASIS, if you know, we came together and we said that's a great tool and it would work really well in the UK as well, because once again, coming back to our overburdened and stretched healthcare system, is that to send pregnant women to someone else to get this magical sign-off or clearance that in reality doesn't even exist. So we said, let's empower women to take ownership of their own health and well-being. Let's revise or adapt the Canadian version of the form to align to our context and our national guidance. And in doing so, we will help to identify those who really need to go and speak to a healthcare professional and have a discussion, and to empower and really reassure those who are healthy that they can continue with their activities. So that's just a little bit of a background around how the tool started. But what it really does, it identifies the contraindications which would necessitate a discussion and an ultimate decision around where the risks and benefits are discussed and a decision is made on an individual basis for that particular woman.
And I think that's the accessibility of that is absolutely fascinating. When it comes to, say, a large part of our audience being sort of MSK professionals of all stripes, how do you see them best using it? Is it in conjunction with, or do you feel it in the spirit of empowerment, it should just be signposting? What's your sort of ideal?
So we've actually had quite a few queries from MSK professionals as well, who specialize in pelvic health, who specialize in pre and postnatal instruction, and they are embedding it as part of their screening and consultation processes within practice. So the tool can be done by women themselves and can be self-administered in the first instance. They can be implemented by leisure centers. So, for example, when they do screening of participants, by personal trainers with pre and postnatal qualifications, and by MSK professionals. So it's multi-use. You can really use it in any setting. But what I think that the really important thing about this tool is that it is accessible, it is simple to use, and it helps to facilitate conversations around physical activity. Because quite often, and I know historically this has happened with me as well, the conversation doesn't even happen. And unless the conversation happens, we are never really going to change, societal beliefs around, the misconceptions surrounding being active in your pregnancy. So it's really about facilitating those conversations and providing reassurance and then making a referral. So for example, the companion healthcare professional part, let's say a woman has ticked yes to any of the questions and she goes to her midwife to say, look, I filled in this form. Can we please discuss my physical activity journey? And the midwife looked at this form and perhaps she needs to refer this lady to a pelvic health physiotherapist. Then there's the option to make the referral. So it facilitates interprofessional collaboration as well. So a really multi-use tool that it can be used by women and professionals alike.
So I've been giving some thought recently, especially in prep for catching back up with you and reading some of your work. I've been giving a lot of thought to the sort of social factors affecting some of these things, not just our healthcare system, but just those societal complexities, such as sort of, for want of a better term, chivalry applied to pregnant women, the pulling up a chair for a pregnant woman, the making sure that they can then sit down on the bus, things that fundamentally I think have still, that is a sensible instinct with regards to there are some physical vulnerabilities to pregnancy. Don't bump the bump, for example, a worthwhile thing, and making sure people aren't suddenly then continuing to participate in full contact sport, for example. But as a general rule, it's something that we would be clumsy for us to do away with completely. But how much is that in its extreme form and the coddling part of what is contributing to us not struggling to move the needle, but like that we know we need to get that message out and bust that myth quite aggressively? So I just wondered if I could just get your thoughts on that broader social piece.
I think that the social piece is a really complex piece. And it's also recognizing that, women are different and every pregnancy will be different. And it's really about meeting women where they are at. So for many women, they feel that they are pregnant, they are not powerless. And perhaps in giving up your seat, they almost find it offensive. But for some women, I can think of myself in my last trimester where I can hardly see my feet and I am knackered and I would really love if someone give up their seat. That is quite a valuable thing. So it's a really hard thing to get right. But it's about having the conversation and meeting women where they are at. So we have in recent years also seen pregnant athletes performing on the international stage and doing really well, but also returning to the international stage and doing really well. So we have seen a lot of advancement in terms of pregnancy not being that stage of disability, but really seeing it just as another life stage that women are moving through. So it is really hard, but I think ultimately if we change the narrative to be more supportive of women in activity, then these societal factors may in some way be reduced. But for me, it is really hard to give you an answer that's going to fit or change every situation, recognizing that there is so much variability in terms of pregnancy. Even a single woman with multiple pregnancies experience them differently. So it's really hard to say, that there's a one-size-fits-all rule to apply.
That makes a lot of sense. I suppose one of the things with that as well is that even beyond pregnancy, it's something that we know no two women would be comfortable to the same or lesser degree from having a door open to them, and that therefore individual specificity is the appropriate way to think about this anyway. And so extending that to social appropriateness rather than thinking that there's a golden rule is probably if not the, it's the best of a bad bunch, even if it needs to be. What do you feel is the future for I suppose I don't mean for the organization, although I'm excited to ask that question next, I suppose. But I suppose I mean like the busting of this myth, the coddling that we talked about at the start. What are the next steps, and what are your hopes and dreams for the society to move forward in this space?
Well, I think the first thing to recognize is that with the national guidance that came into force in 2017, things have changed significantly. All of a sudden, ethical committees are more open to allowing pregnant women in research studies. So that has been a game changer, because we now know more, and we keep pushing those boundaries. So with every study that we publish, we get to explore a little bit more. So in terms of the evidence, I attended a conference where the keynote said, if you want to change anything, do it with evidence. And I think that's where we are heading. As the evidence changes, so too will how we respond to women being active, that will change as well. I would say this, from my PhD, the final concluding statement was around not one size not fitting all, but around potentially trimester specific guidelines, recognizing that 150 minutes of physical activity is perhaps not the best way to go about or see an entire pregnancy journey, and that there might be times where we can accept, perhaps a lower threshold or whatever the case might be, and recognizing that energy requirements do change as pregnancy progresses. So I reckon that's where perhaps the evidence will go, is towards trimester-specific guidelines. But then in terms of giving advice and consultation and practice, I think we are moving towards profiling and identifying women based on, contraindications, based on their previous physical activity status, but also what they hope to achieve within their pregnancy. So recognizing that a conversation with a pregnant elite athlete might look very different to someone who comes into pregnancy, really doesn't like exercise that much, but knows that it's good for them and wants to make a positive change. So there's different profiles, and conversations will look different depending on those profiles.
And I think the MSK community need to get used to considering midwives and obstetricians as part of an MDT. They are naturally going to be lower down the list, if on anyone's list, compared to who they might interact with more broadly. But the importance of us being able to contribute that expertise, as well as the upskilling of those individual professions as well. But those collaborations, they're not as well-trodden paths as they hopefully soon will be. And we've got to blaze that trail, and you continue to do so, as does the Active Pregnancy Foundation. activepregnancyfoundation.org. Fantastic resources, hugely accessible, not just for professionals, but also to signpost directly. It's not, sometimes you've got some foundations that do great work, but then if you're signposting direct for patients, you've got to then reel off like 4 different forward slashes. Your site, as well as the organization, it creates that model that then has different stakeholder groups are really well looked after, and it's translated really sensibly for. So again, compliments to that. But could you tell us a little bit about what the plans are for the organization, for you personally, and also signposting if I've missed anything?
Yes, cool. So the Active Pregnancy Foundation is a really big year for us. So we are hosting in June our first ever Active Pregnancy Foundation Awards, where we will recognize those who do good work in that space. So with a little bit of background. So in terms of the professional standards for personal trainers who qualify as pre and postnatal instructors, That first set of guidance only came out in 2019. And we are releasing a version 2 of those professional standards this year as well. So what we're really aiming to do is raise professional standards for professionals working with this population group. So we'll be recognizing pre- and postnatal instructors. We will be recognizing perinatal healthcare professionals, including pelvic health physios or sports and exercise medicine consultants who work with this population group specifically. We'll also be recognizing community projects, organizations who are inclusive of pregnant women and don't necessarily, cancel their membership when someone tells them they're pregnant. We're doing that, really celebrating all the good work happening in that space. So in that sense, it's groundbreaking. It's never happened in the UK before. Never really paid attention to this population group before. And that's very typical in terms of we quite often exclude pregnant women from everything. So yeah, we'll really be celebrating that. Now, alongside that, every year we have an annual survey around our market and what is really needed. And it's really important for us to understand what it is that women actually need and want. Now, things that we have learned so far is that they don't have access to enough activities that are specifically designed for them. There's only 8% of personal trainers in the UK hold the pre- and postnatal qualification. So we know there's an awful lot of work to do in terms of training professionals to work with this population group. But we also know that, with online workouts being so accessible, that there's variance in terms of the quality of what is out there. So we really want to improve the quality of things that are available. So alongside this, we'll be launching a report. And then we are also working with This Girl Can, SimSpa and UK Active around a report for the leisure and fitness industry specifically. So making sure that those spaces are really inclusive to support women to be active throughout their childbearing years, and that, pregnancy is not the barrier that ultimately stops women from accessing those services and activities in the community. And then, we are hoping that every alternate year we'll be having a conference. So next year we'll be looking at a conference on this topic area specifically. So we're already starting planning for that now, and it hopefully will have a pelvic health stream and a mental health stream and then a physical health stream. So for celebrating the research that is happening in this space and getting that message out there as well.
That's fantastic. Well, as I said before, you guys are super busy, as are you personally. And so thank you so much for all that you do in this area. And it's an absolute pleasure to catch up with you and hopefully just proliferate this message amongst our audience. So where can people find out a little bit more about you and follow your work?
Yeah, so I'm based at Canterbury Christ Church University, where I'm co-director of the Perinatal Physical Activity Research Group. So all things research and academic based, I push through that channel. And then obviously on the Active Pregnancy Foundation website, and you can reach me there. I also have a role with the National Active Partnerships, where I manage the active medicine program. So that's another stream really focusing on upskilling healthcare professionals to promote physical activity as part of their practice. So yeah, I'm everywhere, but you can look me up on Twitter as well. That's probably the professional platform where I connect with professionals most often.
Fantastic. No, thank you so much. And we'll make sure we put those links across the show notes to this. And thanks again for joining us today on Chewing It Over.
No worries. Thanks for having me.
Here at Physio Matters, we think physio matters. Join as a premium member now and access over 500 videos, get free tickets to shows and upgrades included. Access at home, work or on a unicycle to take your knowledge to the moon. Physio-matters.com, more content than you can fit into a gym.